May we start?
I want to get your opinion on something.
To the bigger picture. Now it's time.
From B Media Production, this is Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, and welcome to episode 5 of season 3. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This episode, we speak to Steve Pratt of Pacific Content, a company that produces original podcasts for brands, based in Vancouver, Canada, and some of the best content out there right now. But first, I'd like to welcome my co-host, Chris Ashmore.
G'day, Nick. Now, I suppose to start with, first a shout out to Dave Gertler and the team behind the Australian Podcast Awards. Just a few weeks away, and the event kicks off in Sydney on May the 18th. That's Election Day.
I know. What a coincidence that he's planned it a whole year in advance and managed to nail the election as well.
He's done well. And you're going?
I am going. I'll be there flying the flag for our podcast Business Essentials, which is nominated as a finalist in the business category.
That's right. One thing I've noticed from last year is the quality of podcasts in this country. They're getting better, a lot better. Still a long way to go. But from last year, noticeable level of quality.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely an improvement right across the board, which is great for the industry and great for the listeners out there that are taking the time to tune into podcasts. And for those that may be in Sydney on the 18th of May, please say g'day if you come along to the awards. I'd love to see you.
Absolutely.
But now let's get to your interview today, Chris, with Steve Pratt.
Well, a bit of background first, Nick. Steve Pratt is co-founder of Pacific Content. For those in the podcasting world, it's a big name, a big company. They have been producing original content, original podcasting content for brands since 2014. Some of the podcasts are some of the most well-known branded podcasts in North America. I mean, it's a huge audience, so those cashed-up multinationals are looking at that particular audience, and they include the US company Slack with their podcast Slack Variety Pack. There's also TGIM, or thank God it's Monday, for e-commerce platform Shopify. And most recently, 3.5 Degrees, the new one, 3.5 Degrees, the power of connection for Facebook. What I love about these podcasts, and what everybody loves about these podcasts, is the stories and how well they tell the stories in a narrative style. And they're not infomercials at all. They're kinds of information that people find interesting and entertaining, and they do it so well. Also, I think the title is important. I love those titles that Pacific Content collaborates with their clients on. Choiceology, for example, and we've spoken about this before on Podcasting Essentials way back. It's a podcast for Charles Schwab. We're probably not that familiar with the company here in Australia, but it's a major American financial services firm. The podcast examines irrational decision-making. So they use stories from history where blunders were made from everyday occurrences. And it brings it all back to behavioural economics, and it affects our choices when it comes to investment. So it's a really, really clever concept. And the connection between the topic and the company, Charles Schwab, well, obvious is probably not the right word. It's a good link. It just makes sense. Now, the thing that sets Pacific Content apart from other content makers is that it doesn't do advertising. It purely is all about the brand. So that's what Steve Pratt tells me in this chat, that they focus only on branded content.
Brands are going to be more and more the successful media companies of the future, and that it makes a ton of business sense for them to make shows that are really, really valuable for listeners instead of ads that people want to skip through. And that we have a whole great crew of people from the Canadian public broadcasting system who are amazing storytellers. And if we can find that Venn diagram overlap between a show that people really want to listen to and is every bit as good as every other show that they like, with the business goals and the target audience of one of our clients, it's a win-win on all sides.
It's almost going back to how radio started, where brands would be the sole sponsor of a radio show. I don't know if you're aware with the history of that, but it's almost coming full circle, would you think?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting. I mean, even in early TV had the same thing. I mean, the soap opera is called the soap opera because it was underwritten by soap companies in the early pieces of that period. I think maybe the big difference today is that instead of renting space with a media company, the brand can be a media company in the digital space and start and build their own audience that they own, and that they can build the show with their own strategic objectives in mind instead of just underwriting or sponsoring a show.
And is that the main reason, do you think, or the ultimate reason a brand would jump into doing a podcast? What does a brand get out of it?
So everybody does it for a different reason. This is the really interesting part of our business, is that every time we talk to a new client, there's some different version of what success looks like for them and why they want to do it. And part of our job is to take that business challenge or that business goal and solve it creatively through the execution of a podcast. Most of them have something to do with brand awareness or brand positioning, where you want to build an audience of people who are spending a lot of time with you, and you are either teaching them something that they want to know that you have an expertise in or a strong interest in, or that you're making them happy or entertaining them, and that you're the one who's able to do that. We kind of view the win-win as if you can think of your show as a gift or really creating a lot of value for a listener, and they know that it's you that's doing that, that's where the big win is that they develop a relationship with you and they change the way they think about you and they like you for making their favorite show.
Is there an expectation from brands, though, generally speaking, that you've got to achieve some kind of KPI? They want to be able to see the return on investment. And is that possible?
Well, it depends on what metrics you use and what the business goals are that you need to have the KPI on. So maybe I'll start with the part where it doesn't work, because that's the easiest and maybe the most obvious, is if somebody wants to say, I want a whole bunch of new customers and I want a whole bunch of new sales in the next quarter to come in and buy my products and services, we would say this is probably not the right fit for you, because if you want people to do that, you have to talk about yourself and you have to talk about your products and services every episode. And absolutely no one wants to download an infomercial over and over and over again. So, your goal ultimately has to be, if you're thinking about the audience side of it, is you have to make a real show. You have to make a fantastic show that people would genuinely not just listen to once. It has to be so good that they listen to it once and want to keep coming back over and over and over again. So longer term in a business goal, one way that some of our clients think about it is every single brand touch point that somebody has with you, if you can have an amazing brand experience over and over and over with people, you win compared to your competitors. And whenever they're going to make a buying decision, if they have spent hours with your brand in their ears and it makes them happy and they like you, they're always going to choose you. That's one way of looking at a KPI. We have clients that want to do brand lift research. So that it's really around what people think of them and how they're perceived and what they're associated with. And we work with an amazing research partner called Audience Insights. And they have worked with us to develop this, like a brand lift study where people in the target audience of the client will listen to a couple episodes of the podcast and answer a questionnaire, and it will let them know, do you remember who made this podcast? What did you think about them before? What did you think about them afterwards? What values do you associate with them, before versus after listening? And how much did you like the show? And would you tell other people about it? All those results have been pretty off the charts for our clients. It's a pretty big win there. And that alone is a great KPI for certain clients. And then, if we actually talk about like actual podcast metrics, the fact that you're actually building an audience of people who want to listen to you over time, and you can see growth in the number of people who are coming in and saying, I'm volunteering to spend a half hour with you over and over again. The asset that you own of that audience is really valuable. And if I think about podcasting as a medium or audio as a medium compared to other channels right now, the level of engagement you get with audio is just second to none. We wrote a blog post about the average consumption of audio and thinking about that as a metric that you can get, in a bunch of the podcast providers, and comparing that to video or other pieces. We're getting in 30-minute podcasts anywhere from 85 to 98% completion rates for everybody who listens. That's how long they're making it through the episode. Video doesn't even scratch the surface for that. Like I think, our 30-minute podcasts are better completion rates than a 1-minute video does in one of the benchmarks we looked at. So if a brand is looking to put content out there, there's a pretty strong argument to be made that audio has very unique strengths for long engagement and is really well suited to longer form storytelling.
And that's why you say that the audience asset is so valuable, because of the medium of podcasting itself, that people do stick around and they listen to the whole thing.
Unlike other platforms, they're yours. If you have the size of a stadium of people who want to hear from you every week and they've all opted in, and every time you put something out, you can talk directly to them, there's just a huge value in that actual size of audience that's opted into you.
But the difficulty, though, I suppose, is building that audience or getting the word out and getting people listening. How do you do that?
So this is another really fascinating thing about working with brands. So again, we all kind of come from more of a traditional media company. Every time you work in a media company, no one creating the content ever really has to think that much about reaching an audience, because the media companies already have an audience and the show's going to get promoted by a communications department. When you go into podcasting, everybody starts at zero. Every new podcast is zero. And the really amazing thing about brands is that they have a lot of superpowers to reach a ton of people in a very short period of time. So this is not something we realized out of the gate when we first started doing this, but it became very, very clear that if we could work with our clients to figure out what their superpowers were and kind of created strategies that were similar to how media companies promoted shows, which in some cases are very different than how these channels have been used to promote products and services, it can be very, very effective from building an audience, from zero to a large audience pretty quickly. We make a really fun show called IRL with Mozilla. And they have a lot of superpowers. They own the Firefox browser. They own Pocket, the kind of save the articles for later. And they have an amazing curation app and newsletter. They have huge newsletters of people who want to hear from Mozilla and from Firefox. When they use all their superpowers to be able to tell people about a show that is actually a real show and it's a fantastic show and it's aligned with all the values that Mozilla has, tons of people listen to the episode. They've done a phenomenal job of doing that.
So it really is tapping into existing channels and their own existing customer base via newsletters or their website or whatever. That is, I suppose, the starting point.
Yeah, so I could even go a little bit deeper on that. So on one side, we will always do almost like an audit of all these secret strengths that they may have inside their own company. And we will also help say, what are the other podcasts that are out there that already reach the same target audience or are very similar in subject matter? And are those shows that you might want to advertise on? And what are the most effective types of ad formats that you can use to introduce an existing podcast audience to their next favorite show? So I say those are two separate ones because in a way we think of audience development as people who already listen to podcasts and people who have never listened to a podcast before, and having separate strategies for those has been very effective. So advertising inside other podcasts that are similar to the type of the show that you're making, fairly low-hanging fruit and very strategic and obvious for people who already listen to podcasts and to grab that audience.
Maybe just throw this question in, Steve. Interview style versus narrative style. What are your thoughts?
Well, I am biased, and I recognize we are doing an interview format right now, so I'm careful to, but
don't offend me.
So my position is that, especially for a brand, the narrative format has a lot of benefits going for it. So one, it is really hard to make a great narrative format. You need to have a lot of time and energy and effort and budget to be able to put in to make something that is a half hour long that is really high quality. It's, you're essentially making a half-hour audio documentary. So the barrier to entry on that is pretty high. And if you can do it, it's much easier to differentiate your show in the market. The most common form of a podcast is an interview podcast, precisely because it's easier to do and it is much more affordable to do that type of show. And most people can't put a full production team on a show to make a mini documentary every couple weeks. So when we think about in the market, if you're going to differentiate yourself instantly by going to narrative, you're different than almost every other podcast out there. The other piece is when you think about the range of audiences that are going to listen to these, a powerful half-hour story that has you imagining scenes and characters in your heads and where you have emotions and you feel like you're there and you're imagining all these things happening in your head, the level of engagement that you get with a storytelling format is huge. And I think, as I mentioned, like that theater of the mind capacity of audio is so powerful that if you can get people buying in, that's where they sit in their car for 10 minutes to find out how the story ends when you do it well. And for a brand to be able to have people captivated by a story and have it pay off and to be able to leave with, information or something they've learned at the end of it, also hugely valuable. And maybe the last piece I would say is that a lot of times stories are the best way to bring a complicated idea into the realm of the accessible. That if you have something complicated you want to explain or you want people to be able to remember and tell other people at the end of it, if you tell them a story that unpacks that and brings it to life, it's much more concretely absorbed and, again, much easier to share with other people afterwards.
Interview style can work if it's done well, but I suppose the issue is a lot of brands or companies, they don't have experience in doing it, and it is a skill to be able to do either narrative or interview style.
I think there is a misperception with podcasting that it is easy to do or that anybody can come in and do it well. And in some ways, anybody can make a podcast, but it doesn't mean that anybody should. And I think the way we think about it is, the most valuable thing for anyone who is making content or marketing is people's time and attention. And they're going to be picky. No one's going to choose low quality stuff and nobody's going to choose mediocrity. If you're going to do it, make it awesome. Do something that people are really going to love, or don't bother doing it. And, if you have no background in interviewing and you want to talk about yourself all the time, or you want to talk about your products and services, you're going to spend a lot of time making something that very few people listen to.
Absolutely. Well, I suppose the last question, how do you see, the next 12 months or 2 years when it comes to this industry, podcasting? Are you seeing any big changes? And if they are big, what are they?
I'm a total nerd about growing that group of people who don't listen to podcasts yet. That feels like the most interesting and exciting puzzle for podcasting to solve. And there's all sorts of new data coming out that, there's been a lot of growth in North American audiences in the last year, but it feels like there's a few massive untapped areas. So if I think about Android and everything that Google Podcast is doing, I think that is super exciting around audio showing up in search results in Google now as a way where, you might just be searching, you might be searching about snowboarding at Whistler in Australia. And one of the results might be audio, and there's a play button in your search results, and you click and bang, you're in Google Podcast and you're listening to your first podcast ever. How many billions of search results are served up a day? And the fact that audio's never been in there until, a little under a year ago, it just feels like that organic discovery of podcast is going to become a lot easier in Android. And the fact that there isn't a default Android app that existed prior to Google Podcasts last year, that feels like a massive growth opportunity. What does Android look like, and how can we reach more people on Android? Smart speakers feel like a super interesting space for me, where there's over 100 million of these things that have been sold in the last few years. And they're almost all audio and voice activated. And I will say, I don't think that a lot of current podcasts that are, a half hour or an hour or 2 hours long and that require a huge amount of your foreground attention to stay tuned to it, they may not be the best fit for smart speakers. But for content creators to figure out what formats and what lengths and what purposes audio serves on those devices feels like a hugely interesting challenge that hasn't fully been solved yet. I think the Gimlet Chompers show for kids brushing their teeth in the bathroom, amazing experiment. And I'm assuming it was, from everything I know, is a pretty big success also. But entertaining content designed for a room in the house, for a context of kids brushing their teeth, that encourages a certain behavior in that context at a certain time of day and entertains them and builds a habit of every day you're doing this thing. Super smart. And I would expect to see lots more of that. And then the last piece is just experimentation with formats and different types of content. So, we've talked about interviews and narrative. I think there's a whole world of other types of audio formats that are out there, and the lack of some of those are why there's a big number of people who've still never tried a podcast. And when somebody makes the House of Cards that brought all the people into Netflix all those years ago, somebody's going to make that in podcasting and bring a whole new sea of people into podcasting that have never been in there before. So those are my hopes and wishes and where all the big opportunities are for the next year or two.
Well, there's a lot to look forward to, whatever happens. But for now, Steve, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and good luck with Pacific Content in the future.
Thanks so much. It's really been a pleasure talking with you too.
A fantastic interview, Chris. And I like where Steve was referring to, if you're thinking about doing a podcast, he said, if you're going to do it, make it awesome. And I hope that when Steve listens to this podcast that we live up to his high expectations.
And I think it will. And look, I think there's a very important point, and he's written this in a blog about the difference between narrative and interview style. And the point he was making is that you have to stand out. You've got to be outstanding now when it comes to podcasts. There are so many well-produced ones. There are so many podcasts out there. How do you stand out in your category? And narrative style is a professional way to do it. And it's very hard to do it well. So if you're able to achieve that, you will stand out. But on the other hand, interview style still works. If you know what you're doing, if you've got a team of journalists or you've got a host who has the ability to extract that information from their guest and make it a bit different. Don't do the 1 hour interview style that everybody else is doing. You've got to be able to inject that engagement and make it sound awesome. It can still happen in an interview style podcast, but there's still planning involved. It just doesn't happen on its own.
He talks about in that blog, and for those out there who are interested in this sort of content, the Pacific Content blog is really good. So Steve and the other people in the team there that blog, it's really good stuff. So jump on there and subscribe. But in that blog you're referring to, he says it's all about differentiating yourself from all the other podcasts. You can still differentiate yourself in an interview style podcast, but you've got to do it either with amazing guests that perhaps others haven't got, or with really good production qualities, like hopefully what we produce here. But he also mentioned that there are other ways to stand out other than narrative format, because not everybody listening to this podcast can afford to do a narrative podcast because they are more expensive, a lot more time and effort goes in. Another way of standing out, he mentioned, was the magazine format. And
is this in his blog?
Yes.
Okay. Yep.
Very self-indulgent here because it is about us, because we produce and have been for 35 years an audio magazine format. And he references This American Life in the podcasting world. Ours is Business Essentials, which is actually an audio magazine. It's behind a paywall on our website, so it's a little bit different to a podcast. But the point he makes is the same reason why we did it, which is bringing together a whole list of people and interviewees and packaging them together into the one magazine style, which is different to a narrative style. It's still interview-based, but grouping them together rather than that narrative style, which does take that extra level of production nous and journalistic skill and scripting to be able to pull it off. So you can do things differently with interviews to stand out from the crowd.
Well, that magazine-style business program that we do, it's 80 minutes long. We have 8 or 9 speakers on different subject matters on how to run a better business, from sales and marketing to tax advice to leadership. And it's engaging because you're jumping from one to the other. Everybody seems to want to follow the same formula of a podcast of 1 hour with one subject. And if that interviewee is no good, they don't stop it after 5 minutes. They keep going for an hour because that's the formula that they've set themselves. So they're producing a podcast based on a formula and not with the audience's intentions or engagement in their mind. It's ridiculous. One thing that we are adamant about at B Media Production when we do an interview, we always do our planning and ensure that they are good speakers and they've got something worthy to say. But there is always that chance that they're not very good at being interviewed, they're not very good communicators, and if they don't hit a particular level of quality, they don't make the cut.
And probably the last point I want to touch on is, again, he was referring to another one of their awesome blogs about the stats around the engagement of audio versus video. And thank you, Steve, for actually doing some work on this and putting out some stats, because we talk about it in general terms a lot, that audio is really engaging and you can have longer form conversations. But to actually see the figures that they can get 85 up to almost 100% completion rate of a 30-minute podcast when compared to video it's down around 14% if it's longer than 30 minutes. And even at only 90 seconds, the highest it kind of gets is about 60%. It's a huge difference.
That's right.
And for awareness, videos are terrific. They stand out. They jump off the page when you're scrolling through social media. And we talked about this before. You can use shorter form video to promote longer form audio. Well, I think that's about all we've got time for in today's episode of Podcasting Essentials. For more about us and how we can help you use audio content to build engagement, go to be.com.au. From all of us at B Media Production, thanks so much for listening.